Hello everyone, Helen here. How are you doing? I hope you're all right, and thanks for coming to join me. You can see I'm in the camper van, and that means I've got another trip to share with you. Thought you might like to come along. We've just had school half-term holiday, and I don't do my piano teaching in the shorter holidays anyway, and so we took the chance to go away, but just for 3 nights. And so we didn't want to go too far, and I took a look at the map, and I found a bit of England which I decided I'd never ever been to before. And I'm sure I've been to most places in England now, but over the years, but no. So this was the county of Lancashire, and within that there's an area called the Forest of Bowland, and I thought, well, I like the sound of that, so let's go there. Let's go and find out, some new places. It turns out that it wasn't quite as I imagined, because it didn't mean forest in the traditional sense of there being lots and lots of trees, like a big forest. But an alternative definition of forest is apparently royal hunting ground. So from the distant past, when the royalty had big estates where they would go hunting. So it's an area of a lot of heather moorland and blanket bog, and also some ancient woodland as well, but it's certainly not a big forest as I thought. Anyway, we had a great time anyway, and we even found on the way home a really lovely craft shop, so I'm going to show you what I bought later. I've got my bag here, so I'm going to show you. Yeah, that was really nice. So we decided not to book into any campsites or anything, although in England it's not strictly allowed to just camp where you want to, unlike in Scotland where there's much more freedom for camper vans. And but we decided that we weren't going to be causing anybody any problem. We would just be tucked away somewhere, and we're a small black van, and we didn't really think anybody would take any notice of us, which turned out to be the case, so it was fine. You might be happy to know that I was much more comfortable sleeping in the van this time, because some of you had given me some good advice on sort of mattress toppers and things. So I actually managed to find an offcut of some memory foam to use, and I made 2 mattresses in fact, and I used an old duvet cover to I cut that in 2, and I made covers for the bits of foam, and it was just so much more comfortable, even though it was only, I think it's 2.5 centimetres or just over an inch thick, but it just made all the difference. So I was really comfortable at night, so that was good. So I think without any more delay, I'm going to take you on another camper van trip, so come along with me. So off we went, heading in a roughly southwesterly direction, out of County Durham where we live, and through the Yorkshire Dales and into Cumbria. And after a very pleasant drive, we decided to stop for a cup of tea at a lovely spot on the edge of the Howgill Fells in the southern part of Cumbria, which is just south of the Lake District. As usual, I really appreciated sitting in the van in a peaceful spot with a lovely view and a cup of tea in my hand. The weather was fairly mild, though a bit damp at times, but we were able to have the side of the van open whilst still remaining sheltered, which is really nice. I especially enjoyed watching the sheep that were around us, who didn't seem to mind us being there and quietly stood there munching the grass. Pearl and Dean seemed to enjoy admiring the view too. In the car park there was an information board that told us all about a geologist called Adam Sedgwick. He was born locally in the late 18th century, and he was the first person to identify a geological feature called the Dent Fault, a huge fault in the Earth's crust where the ancient rocks that now make up the Howgill Fells, which we were looking at, they were forced upwards by the younger limestone of the Yorkshire Dales. Phil, as usual, was very excited to go and witness this geological feature that he hadn't seen before. So off we went, heading down to the gorge to take a look at the Dent Fault. We soon came to a sign that told us we were following the Sedgwick Trail, which was named after the aforementioned geologist. And what a lovely walk it turned out to be. Not only was there some beautiful autumnal colour, there was so much rushing and swirling and twirling of the water that it was very hard to stop taking more and more videos. On returning to the van, we drove very carefully over an extremely potholy car park. I don't know when I last saw such an uneven surface for a car park. And we continued our way through more hills and dales on fairly quiet roads with some wonderful countryside around us. One of the things I love about being in the camper van is travelling along at a greater height than when I'm in a car. I don't really like travelling in cars very much. And it always feels as though I'm on top of the world and have a really good view of everywhere. We reached a town called Kirkby Lonsdale, and just after that we crossed the county border into Lancashire. After assessing and choosing an overnight spot while we still had daylight, we then drove to a pub in a little village called Ray, a very cosy, quiet place with a fire to warm us, and we had a very delicious meal before driving to our parking place for the night. So we had a very peaceful night in the little lay-by that we'd chosen, just off a quiet country road, though because we were fairly close to the edge of a village, we decided not to put the roof up, just to remain as incognito as possible. Our first job of the day was to check out another overnight spot, this time up on the side of a hill called Caton Moor, next to some wind turbines. It felt very remote, and there was a great panorama of the surrounding countryside, and we could even see as far as the sea on the west coast. So having satisfied ourselves that this would be a good spot, we headed back down the hill and drove to the city of Lancaster, which is right on the western edge of Lancashire. So the focus of our visit to Lancaster was the castle, which has got a very long history dating from Roman times, in fact. And in the 14th century it belonged to John of Gaunt, who was the father of King Henry IV. Since then, it's always been owned by the reigning monarch, who's known as the Duke of Lancaster, whether they're male or female, so our late Queen Elizabeth was known as the Duke of Lancaster. Until 2011, the castle served as a fully functioning Category C prison, and there are still working law courts in here, but no longer the prison. The only way to see inside the castle is to join a guided tour, and we weren't disappointed. Our guide was a very knowledgeable and entertaining young lady who did a good job of bringing the history of the castle to life. Unfortunately, photography wasn't allowed inside the castle. But we learnt that the castle had been used as a prison for at least 900 years, and we heard all about the grim, inhumane conditions that prisoners were held in. It was interesting to learn that in the early 17th century, the Lancashire witch trials, which included some people from Pendle that were accused of witchcraft, were held at this castle, and the accused were possibly held in the dungeons of this tower. In the 19th century, the castle was visited by Elizabeth Fry, a social reformer, who was quite impressed with the conditions in the Lancaster prison, and certainly there'd been great improvements since the previous centuries, when prisons were just held in exceptionally cramped conditions, in complete darkness, and with no toilet or sleeping facilities. I just can't imagine it. After lunch in the very pleasant Castle Cafe, we headed for the coast to visit the seaside town of Morecambe. The rain held off for most of the afternoon, so we were able to enjoy a very nice stroll along the promenade. I loved the pretty paving that edged the prom. One reason for our visit was to see the statue of one of Britain's best-loved comedians, Eric Morecambe, and who was a particular favourite of Phil's. A few years after his death in 1984, a bronze statue was erected in his hometown here of Morecambe, which is where he took his stage name from. He's shown in his characteristic pose, dancing along to the song Bring Me Sunshine. I'm sure he would be very amused to think that so many people have posed next to him, and maybe they felt a little of his great sense of humour. The whole area around the statue has been very thoughtfully laid out, with lots of Eric Morecambe's famous quotes. And I also love these little bronze pigeons who seem to be looking on with interest. I decided then that it had been too many years since I'd last tasted some seaside rock, so we headed for a seafront shop, and I chose some traditional mint-flavoured sticks of pink rock, and was very pleased to see that the name of the place is still embedded in the centre of the rock, although the sweet itself didn't seem nearly as hard as I remembered, because as a child I used to have to suck it for days on end, and usually ended up with a bit of a sticky mess. As we strolled a bit further along the seafront, we spotted some lovely sculptures and some decorated fences, and it was great to look out over the Irish Sea. The sea in this area goes out a very long way at low tide, leaving huge expanses of flat sand, which can be quite dangerous in places the further out you go. Well, the rain returned, so we went back to the van and we had cups of tea before heading out for our overnight spot up on Caton Moor. We stopped off in the village of Caton for a meal at the station hotel, and then we drove up the hill through the darkness. In the morning, our view was concealed by a thick mist, making us feel we were really hidden away. When the mist started to clear and breakfast was over, Phil decided to go for a walk, and I stayed in the van for a bit of quiet crochet time and watched the view gradually returning, the wind turbines reappearing as well as a few friendly sheep. The wind turbines weren't noisy, by the way, unless you stood directly underneath them. We set off down the hill, admiring the views in all directions, and drove to a little market town called Garstang. We made use of a cafe and toilets at a very nice supermarket, then enjoyed a wander round the town, looking at some of the blue plaques that form part of the Heritage Trail, learning a little bit about its history as a market town, where the weekly market began over 800 years ago, it's believed. Garstang also has the Lancaster Canal running through it, so we spent a little time wandering along the towpath and reminiscing about our past narrowboating holidays. The rain had held off all morning, but by lunchtime it returned with a vengeance, and we headed away from the town and into an area called the Trough of Bowland, which is a valley and high pass that forms part of the Forest of Bowland. and this has been designated as an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's sparsely populated, and we'd definitely describe it as a hidden gem. Other areas of England get lots of attention, but the Forest of Bowland is much less well known. Anyway, despite the rain, we were quite blown away by the wild beauty of the area, which was extra beautiful because of all the autumn colours. We found a perfect spot to park in for lunch, by a river and surrounded by gorgeous trees and some toadstools, and it all felt quite magical. We felt very contented sitting there with our bacon butties for lunch, followed by some Lancashire cheese, which was really tasty, and some oat biscuits. We spent quite a while sitting there, in fact, and I got on with a bit of sock knitting, working on the second of the simple skip socks that I started a while ago. We set off again, and keeping an eye out this time for possible overnight spots, and just enjoying the wonderful landscape. We settled on a large lay-by for our third and final overnight spot for this trip. It was not far from a little village called Dunsop Bridge. There was very little traffic, and we had no complaint about the location, which had a lovely view down to the river. Pearl and Dean also took the opportunity to appreciate their surroundings. And before it got too dark, Phil got the Kelly kettle out to boil some water for cups of tea, and we just enjoyed our chosen spot until the sun went down. A little later we cooked a meal that consisted of a cheese and onion sauce, some carrots and some tortelloni, and we accompanied this with some local beer that we'd bought earlier in the day, which I chose because I liked its name, the Pendle Witch's Brew, as well as the imaginative description of the beer. Summoned by the witches, this mystical beast prowls in the shadows, stalking its prey, ready to pounce, and so on. I did enjoy its crisp, fruity aftertaste that it promised, but Phil, who's not really much of a beer drinker, wasn't so sure. Our last day began with a beautiful sunrise, and I was very excited about the perfectly positioned tree that was silhouetted against the pink sky. I took lots of photos, although I really wished I'd brought my proper camera to get some better photos. However, I think the photos I took give a reasonable idea of the gorgeous colours and reflections in the side of the van. Our drive that morning took us out of the Trough of Bowland and northwards through the isolated roads of the rest of the Forest of Bowland. Between the towns on the southern and northern edges of the Forest of Bowland, there are actually only 2 villages, and we met very little traffic along the way. It was another case of me wanting to take more and more videos of the landscape, which just kept taking our breath away as the road wound and undulated its way north. As we entered a little village called Sladeburn, we thought it looked so attractive that we decided to stop and have a look round. It's a typical English country village, and if it hadn't been for all the cars, you would really feel as though you'd stepped back in time. The village contains 50 listed buildings that are recorded in the National Heritage List for England, which means that they can't be altered in any significant way, and many of the buildings have interesting histories. In medieval times, Sladeburn was the administrative centre of the Forest of Bowland, and the law courts have been preserved inside what is now the Hark to Bounty Inn, which is thought to have been there since the 13th century, although the main fabric of the building that we see now dates back to the 17th century. It's essentially a farming community, although at one time it had a thriving woolen industry, as well as breeding rabbits for making fur hats. The village church dates back to 1450 and has a number of interesting features, including some box pews that were built between the 17th and 19th centuries. It was great to be able to go inside the church and have a close look at them, spotting clues as to when they were made and just really appreciating this connection with the past, wondering about the lives of all the different people who had once sat there in those pews. Next to the church, there's rather an unusual looking village school called Brennan's Endowed School. It was built in 1717 by a local gentleman who wanted somewhere for the local boys of the parish to be educated. It's rather a beautiful building, though I did spot a modern extension at the back of the school, which was more in keeping with today's educational needs. We continued on our way through the Forest of Bowland, enjoying the colours brought out by the sunshine that we had that day, until finally we reached the northern edge and soon left Lancashire and arrived in the Yorkshire town of Ingleton. We had a light lunch at Bernie's Cafe, and then I couldn't resist popping into a little craft shop that I'd spotted on our walk through the town. Craftopia is a really friendly little shop, absolutely packed with all sorts of crafty goodies. It has an excellent selection of lots of my favourite yarns, including scapiers and Rico and Stylecraft, as well as a great selection of independent hand-dyed yarns. And plus I spotted some beautiful fabrics and all sorts of other little bits and bobs. I did come away with a few things, as I said, that I just couldn't resist. So I got some balls of Rico cotton, including this one with pastel colours in it, and a larger ball of yarn with different tones of blue. I think I must be into blues at the moment. And I also decided to buy a book of crochet birds. I've been looking for one for a while. I've got one for knitting birds, but not for crochet. And I also couldn't resist one Christmassy fat quarter, which will probably sit in my stash for a while until I decide what to do with it. But anyway, if you're ever in Ingleton in Yorkshire, I definitely recommend that you go and pay Craftopia a visit. After that, it really was time to head for home. We had a great drive through the Yorkshire Dales, through some wonderful scenery, and we made one more stop just to stretch our legs part way home. And we took a little walk to see the Ribblehead Viaduct that crosses Batty Moss. And it's the largest of 21 viaducts on the Settle to Carlisle Railway. It's really quite a magnificent structure, and you really appreciate the size of it when you stand right beneath it. Building of the viaduct was completed in 1874, and most of the 2,300 workers lived in shanty towns next to the construction site, and sadly over 100 men lost their lives during the construction. The railway line was threatened with closure in the 1980s, but thankfully it was saved and it's remained open, and it's now quite a popular tourist attraction. And if you've ever been on the train between Settle and Carlisle, you'll know that it is a very scenic journey indeed, well worth visiting if you haven't experienced it before. So then it was just back into the van and we had to set off for the final part of our journey home. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed coming with me again, and I'm going to leave you there and see you again very soon. So take great care of yourself, keep nice and busy, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye.